Hello and welcome to another virtual panel discussion from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. Following on from yesterday's very successful panel, this is the second part of our discussion on the future of NGOs. Today we are joined by some fantastic scholars and practitioners to discuss the important and multifaceted role played by NGOs, specifically in supporting and implementing the responsibility to protect. We hear time and again that prevention is at the core of the responsibility to protect, and that it's something we really cannot emphasize enough. And as with the broader atrocity prevention agenda, its success is largely measured in things which do not happen. And NGOs play an important role in preserving the memory of victims and documenting atrocity crimes, which works towards holding perpetrators to account. And many organisations play a critical role in developing and institutionalising the norms and best practices around the responsibility to protect. The work of these NGOs has arguably never been more important. Yet in the current context of deep political and economic crises, many of these bodies might find that their activities are restricted, if not threatened altogether. How can NGOs adapt to these challenging new circumstances? And what might be the consequences for the atrocity prevention agenda if funding and travel restrictions severely impede their work? These are some of the important questions we'll be discussing today. I am Tom Peake, Research Associate at the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge, and I'm joined today by Dr. Karen Smith, Special Advisor to the United Nations Secretary General on the Responsibility to Protect, Kerry Wigan, Assistant Professor of Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention at Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention. And finally, Wei Wei Nu, Founder and Director of U Leadership Center in Yangon and current Obama Foundation Scholar at Columbia University. And welcome also to our truly global audience. I encourage you to submit questions to our fantastic panel through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Just click it open, send off your question, and it will be directed to our panel. And please do note if your question is directed to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. And also please do leave your name and your university or other institutional affiliation should you have one. And now, before we get into the questions from our audience, I will invite each of our speakers to say a few words, beginning please with Karen Smith.
All right. Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the Centre for Geopolitics and of course Thomas in particular, not just for inviting me to participate in tonight's panel, but for keeping the responsibility to protect on the agenda. And I just heard that this is actually the 8th webinar that they are hosting on the topic of R2P. And so, I just want to focus on the fact that it's important that while everyone is understandably focused on dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic, we should not forget that many people around the world continue to face many other risks. And this has been highlighted by the protests against systemic racism in the US and the resultant global response. And so individuals and communities around the world continue to face the daily risk of being victims of atrocity crimes. And certain populations, including ethnic and religious minorities, women, and refugees are particularly vulnerable. And of course, we know that this vulnerability has in many cases been exacerbated by the pandemic and also by government responses to it. Now, some of you might wonder about today's topic because you might be thinking, well, isn't R2P a matter for states? Now, while the 2005 World Summit outcome document indeed puts the emphasis on the fact that states have the primary responsibility to protect populations against atrocity crimes, we know that states often fail to fulfill their responsibilities. This is sometimes due to a lack of political will or a lack of capacity, but in some cases, states are also the perpetrators of atrocity crimes. And so in short, we cannot only rely on states. Atrocity prevention really is everyone's business. And this requires partnerships between national governments, civil society, individuals, regional organizations, and of course the United Nations. And NGOs are a particularly important partner in the fight against atrocity crimes. My office, for example, works very closely with a number of NGOs in different parts of the world on various issues, including working with religious leaders in resolving tensions between communities. Now, Thomas has already mentioned that, of course, NGOs can play a number of different roles. And while today's webinar focuses more on advocacy and memory, we know that NGOs are also essential in the operational side of R2P, including in early warning, prevention, protection, and peace building. And so maybe these are issues that we can talk more about in the Q&A. I want to say a few words about how invaluable NGOs are in advocating for the implementation of the responsibility to protect and in holding states accountable. This includes both global NGOs that focus specifically on the R2P, like the Global Center on R2P, and umbrella organizations like the International Coalition for R2P that brings together a range of global and local NGOs, but also national NGOs who can influence the political will of key actors to undertake preventive and early action. And here I want to point out that actually many more NGOs are engaged in atrocity prevention and R2P than they might actually themselves realize. Because there is often this misconception that R2P is a foreign policy issue, or it's about military intervention, or it's something that really the UN Security Council deals with. But at its core, as Thomas said, R2P is really about the prevention of atrocity crimes. So in fact, much of the work that's done by NGOs to promote human rights, for example, ultimately builds stronger, resilient societies which are less vulnerable to atrocities. Similarly, we also know that human rights violations are often the precursors to atrocity crimes. So NGOs that monitor and raise the alarm about such violations are in essence contributing to atrocity prevention. And I want to emphasize here particularly that this does not only apply to NGOs working so-called in the field in other countries or to grassroots organizations working in conflict zones, but also to NGOs who are fighting racism and other forms of discrimination in Europe and in the USA. Now, while Kerry will speak more about the role of NGOs in relation to memory, I want to add that we should also not underestimate the important role that these organizations can play in holding perpetrators accountable. For example, the work they do in monitoring and documenting atrocity crimes becomes essential for the criminal justice process. And this in turn plays a crucial role in preventing recurrence and is therefore part of the broader prevention agenda. And this is something hopefully that we can speak more about in the Q&A session as well, that prevention really is a much broader process than simply something that happens at the beginning before atrocity crimes take place. It's something that happens throughout the process and also afterwards. But I'll stop here for now, and I really look forward to hearing what Kerry and Wei Wei have to say and engaging in a discussion with everyone who's listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Karen. And now we turn to Kerry Wigan.
Thank you so much. I'm really grateful for the invitation. I want to begin, as I do with all public presentations, by acknowledging that I'm speaking from New York City, which is the ancestral land of the Lenni Lenape people, especially when we're talking about memory in relationship to atrocities. I think one of the important things about memory is acknowledgement and acknowledging victims of genocide, and also how we are all beneficiaries of past, or we can be beneficiaries of this past violence that other groups have suffered. So as Karen mentioned already, R2P generally is framed and conceived of as a state-focused framework. And I think what we're seeing now is a moment of crisis for this framework, where it's failing to gain traction in many, many cases. Because as much as in 2005, the world agreed that sovereignty, to this principle that sovereignty is a responsibility and not something inherent, an inherent right of states, what we still are seeing is that the majority of the time, states' efforts states are working to preserve traditional conceptions of sovereignty right now. And this is also a result of a real failure, I think, to genuinely articulate a framework and a protocol for pillars 1 and 2 of R2P. And here, especially, is where focusing on NGOs and the work that NGOs can do, but more importantly, the work that NGOs have been doing for a very long period of time, is in strengthening those first 2 pillars of R2P, because ultimately the work of most NGOs is the work of pillars 1 and 2 of R2P. This is also happening, obviously, within the context, global context of increased isolationism that's been accompanied by this democratic backsliding in both the global north and the global south, and in many, many countries around the world. And in this context, then, we're seeing that the NGO sector, the civil society sector, is the only sector there to step up in this moment. And this is there's nothing new about this, because what we know very well is that in the context of both mass atrocities and in the aftermath of mass atrocities, it has almost always been victims, survivors, and memory activists who have been the first to spur preventive action, to spur active engagement with the past and engagement with the legacies of that violent past that are still performing other forms of violence in the present. It has always been those civil society actors who have stepped up first in the face of what are typically reluctant state actors. Oftentimes, especially in the aftermath of mass violence, states are not so interested in directly engaging with that past violence. It's much easier to talk about moving forward, rebuilding, but even despite the fact that international norms now say that we can't really move forward without first looking backward. So it becomes the undue burden, really, of usually those who have been most directly targeted by that violence to stand up and demand that the states respond to the harms that they have suffered. And it's an unfair burden, I want to stress. I think Weiwei, I've known Weiwei for a couple of years, and I've heard her talk very frequently about this, and I imagine she may talk about this again, but it becomes really tiring that the people who have most suffered under this violence continue to have to be the ones to demand attention, to demand that others stand up as well, to demand that states accept the responsibility that they've already acknowledged should be the responsibility in all but action. Typically, this preventive action that civil society actors can take through memory can take any number of forms. Typically, when we think about memory, we're thinking about the creation of spaces or sites of memory, but memory activism and memory action by civil society can take any number of forms, and we're seeing it take those forms all over the world. This includes grassroots activism that directly calls upon the past in the present, but it also includes things like educational programming and outreach, 2 things that have typically been seen as the purview of the state, but more and more we see NGOs filling and taking up this responsibility and role of educational programming when states are not doing so, through artistic and cultural interventions. And more we're seeing, for instance, the NGO sector take over this responsibility and role of using sites of memory and spaces of memory to engage with prevention, to engage with the past in a preventive mode, to engage with acknowledgement and recognition. One great example of that is the new National Memorial for Peace and Justice that opened fairly recently in Montgomery, Alabama in the United States. This is a monument to the victims of Black American victims of lynching, predominantly in the American South. And this memorial, which is one of the most incredible memorials you'll see, has been completely civil society run, completely funded by civil society. So we're seeing, again, in these places where the state is failing to step up, it's NGOs who are taking that responsibility and are taking that role. And then I also want to speak not only from the perspective of an academic working at Binghamton University's Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention, but also as a practitioner working at an international NGO called the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. We are an NGO that works predominantly with state actors on institutionalizing atrocity prevention. And also, and one of the key things we're trying to do is reframe what that means. What do we actually mean by atrocity prevention? and trying to work with state actors to think about those first two pillars of R2P, to think about atrocity prevention not only as intervention in the midst of mass killing, but as building public policies and public constituencies so that the most vulnerable populations in any given society are seeing reductions in their risk so that they don't become the victims of the next mass atrocities. I'll stop there for now, but I look forward to the conversation to come.
Many thanks, Kerry. And finally, before we begin taking questions from the floor, and I'm sure there'll be many, please, Wei Nu.
Oops, I got it. Thank you very much for having me today, and I'm really honored to speak with distinguished speaker, and very nice to see you again, and all of you. My work primarily based in Myanmar, so I'll be talking about my experiences and my understanding on the R2P over the last several years. So I run an organization in Myanmar. It's called Women Peace Network, and I also run a youth center. It's Yangon Youth Leadership Center. As Women Peace Network, one of our major focus is atrocity preventions and human rights protections of the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities in Myanmar. We have been actually conducting monitoring and doing awareness raising and early warning, policy advocacy and peace building in line with the atrocity preventions, although we don't necessarily use it frame it as atrocity preventions, but then, we've been doing this work due to the, many other sensitivity issues around the war responsibility to protect R2P itself. To give some context on Myanmar, recent year in Myanmar, R2P was in vogue due to the cyclone Nargis in 2008. NGOs and activists try to support R2P to deliver aid to Nargis affected victims, even welcoming foreign navies. At that time, R2P was, generally speaking, it was a good thing, and states and the UN put effort to act. And UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon went to see General Than Shwe, the head of the state, military head during that time, but Than Shwe didn't agree to his acts to prevent the people. And ASEAN pressure Myanmar, ASEAN step in and pressure Myanmar, saying that if you don't allow aid, humanitarian aid to the affected communities, we will allow US Navy to enter. So the states, the region, the ASEANs and the UN, the other state actors take initiative and step to apply this framework, and it works at that time. But then, military has traditionally saw the R2P as, they're from their point of view, militaristic point of view, see as an invasion. So that's why, they even moved their Naypyidaw after that time, moved the capital to Naypyidaw, from Yangon to Naypyidaw. And they try to make their view popular, and they create fear among the populations when it's come to R2P, and they weren't able to do it. But now, if you zoom forward on the issue of Rohingya, now it has been seen as a national security threat. When we talk about R2P, and we become national traitors. So that's how they have been able to brainwash the populations. So although some of the NGOs and CSO, civil society organizations, including us, try to promote the R2P, many groups inside the country, because of this framing of the R2P by the government and by the military, many of these groups were very nervous. They didn't want to be seen as supporting an invasion. So therefore, it wasn't too popular. On the other hand, in my experience, it was also even very difficult to talk about the from the R2P perspective, even in the UN system. I think it is because many states are intentionally refusing to commit to R2P obligations. And also, I think it's also because of the differences in ideological approach. Some of the states approach in a more comprehensive manner, I mean, a couple of them, I guess, but most of them, simply approach from the humanitarian aspect. And I think this is one of the obstacle that we're facing in promoting the R2P framework itself and really providing protection to the people who need the support. And I believe we shouldn't be restricting this to the humanitarian response, because it is not sustainable approach, and we have seen it. We were not able to provide protection to the Rohingya. If we were able to take actions earlier, we could have been prevented. This crisis could have been prevented. The 1 million plus Rohingya might not become refugees, and many may have not been killed or raped. So, we were late. I think it's because of the approaches and the policies that the fear among the states and the lack of commitment to the obligations. And at the same time, it has been seen as it has been rendered controversial by the vested interest, because as I said, it's implied obligations and also still early to many, relatively new concept to many. And I believe, we need to, it was for me and many other colleagues who have been conducting advocacy, it's been really extremely difficult to talk about this. We are seen as radical, or, as if we're talking about something that is not realistic. And I think it was so damaging. Now we need to reframe it to a human-centered approach, and we need to listen to the affected communities, and we need to be able to listen and console and get involved the affected community throughout these processes. They and the national community were late. Not only the framework was new and sensitive domestically, because it was sensitive outside as well, and they were slow to act. And now we are in trouble, really in trouble. And even now in Rakhine State and in Myanmar, atrocities continue to happen. In Rakhine State and in Chin State, almost 9 states and divisions of the countries, we are having continuous and consistent fighting and civil war and target against the civilian populations. We have averaged about 100 attacks against the civilian populations in a month in Rakhine State. So having said that, now we have these on Myanmar, we have these 2 international investigative processes and 2 international judicial processes. I think it is really fascinating, and it's actually really validating and affirming, kind of having first time having a recognition for the victims and survivors having these processes. And I think we need to take this opportunity, to broaden the understanding of R2P and provide the protections, to the survivors and victims. And also it is time to actually, talk discussions beyond states and its people within the state. It is time to broaden the discussions and time to talk about obligations in the neighboring countries as well. For example, nowadays you're seeing that, you know, the refugees have been turned away from Malaysia, and you know, there are hate speech and like discriminations ongoing in neighboring countries against the refugees and asylum seekers and migrant workers. And this, you know, if the neighboring countries in the region, for example, ASEAN and other neighboring countries, are not basically approaching, like committing or taking effort to use this R2P framework to provide protections to these survivors and refugees and asylum seekers, we will just be prolonging the crises. So that's why I think it is one of the things that I would like to encourage everybody to consider, is to broaden the discussions, to bring discussions beyond states and its citizens or its people, but to the broader protections in the regions and by the international community. Finally, you know, nowadays, you know, states are actually preoccupied by the COVID response, and kind of these states and decision makers are actually preoccupied with the COVID and not responding to others. And therefore, you know, the atrocities are continuing, and it's become more and more serious because there is no accountability and check and balance and as well as there is no kind of stronger push for this kind of behavior by the states. And I would say, you know, the last point that I want to make is that, you know, when we talk about responsibility to protect, in our experience, although some of the NGOs and some of us are trying to work on this, but then at the end, when we really talk about this issue as it titles, it's end up having like academic discussions and policy discussions, and it's end up having on the paper, like for example, like it may have come up with like some resolutions or you know, like some papers or like that. It's end up having like a paper outcome. It's not practical outcome. So we need actors, the you know, the states and institutions and UN take action, more practical actions, rather than ending up as academic discussions or policy discussions. And when it's come to Myanmar, we still need to keep eyes on the Burmese military, and you know, we need now immediately need to call to end the human rights violations against Rohingya, Rakhine, and other ethnic communities in Myanmar. And you know, these frameworks and people who have been working around this has to be continue supporting accountability mechanisms, and also contribute to the legislative and institutional reform domestically in the country to prevent recurrence. So thank you very much. I will end here, and I am happy to have discussions, further discussions through question and answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wei Wei, and thank you to all of our panelists for your interventions. And just a reminder to the audience, please do feel free to submit questions to our panel through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and mention who your questions directed to. But first of all, I just wanted to pick up on something that was kind of hinted at, is that in the current coronavirus crisis and the resultant political and economic fallout, it seems that governments are going to be governments all over the world, including in the developed world, and kind of donor governments, are going to be likely entering some kind of fiscal recession. In this case, how does the NGO community make the case for continued support for prevention activities when prevention is largely measured in things which don't happen. I just turn to Kerry, perhaps, for his views on this first.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So first, I would push back against this idea, which is very commonly held, that prevention can only be measured by this non-event, that prevention succeeds when nothing happens. I think that this is a big problem that we've been dealing with for many, many years. And it leads to, and the reason it's a problem is twofold. First of all, by qualifying or assessing something as an intervention as preventive only by this non-event, one, it's making it impossible to prove that anything is preventive to people who are skeptical from the beginning. It makes it really easy for them to argue that nothing is preventive because that atrocity was just never going to happen to begin with. So why should we be spending our time, effort, or money and resources into prevention efforts? But two, it really oversimplifies the problem and the process of prevention. We know incredibly well at this point that genocides and mass atrocities are complex social and political processes. They are not events that happen out of nowhere overnight. They're long-term processes that start long before they result in the mass killing of large numbers of people, right? Why would we think about this long and complex process as having one single solution, as there being a silver bullet that could stop that long process from taking place? Complex problems require complex solutions, and therefore there's no single intervention that ever is going to be successful on its own at preventing an atrocity from taking place. Rather, there's many, many different interventions that are working complementarily from many different sectors of society that are going to be successful at preventing the sorts of atrocities that we typically associate with the term. At the Auschwitz Institute and through my research at Binghamton, one thing that I've really been pushing for is actually thinking about ways that we can quantitatively and qualitatively measure prevention. So we're not just talking about this non-event problem. I'll give you an example. I just completed a year-long research project that was funded by DFID in the UK, which very unfortunately we just found out yesterday is being merged within the Foreign Office, which I think is going to, maybe we'll talk about this later, but I think it could lead to some really big deficits in prevention work around the world. But anyway, they funded a research project on how truth commissions in the aftermath of mass atrocity may contribute to prevention. And in this research project, we measured prevention in a very specific way. We know quite well over the last 10 to 15 years, we've developed these risk assessment models that are very good at predicting what societies are at highest risk for atrocities to take place. We know the risk factors that put a society at risk for mass violence. We have the UN Framework of Analysis for Atrocity Crimes. We have some really good risk assessment models out of Australia National University, the Political Instability Task Force. So the question then becomes, if we know these risk factors very well that put a society at risk for mass atrocity, then we should be able to measure if an intervention contributes to prevention by measuring if any one of those risk factors has been mitigated in some way by that intervention. Likewise, we can measure the success of an intervention by measuring how the human rights or the quality of life of vulnerable populations have been demonstrably improved by an intervention. Because if the rights are of a certain group that are particularly vulnerable are being protected in a more visible way, with their economic livelihood, social, political livelihood is improved in some way, that is also contributing to prevention. Not doing everything, not solving prevention, right? But it's contributing to prevention. And what we found in this research project is if we compare societies, for instance, that have implemented truth commissions versus those that have not in the aftermath of mass violence, those that have implemented truth commissions, we see higher levels of governmental trust, higher levels of protection of civil liberties and political rights, rule of law, equality before the law, access to justice, women's political empowerment, just to name a few. That's not to say that the truth commissions are doing all that on their own. But usually when we see these big political and social responses to mass violence like truth commissions, that indicates that there are other things happening within that society, oftentimes at the civil society level, that are also contributing to the improvement of rights and therefore contributing to prevention on a wider scale. So then to respond to the question specifically, why should governments, donor governments, be funding NGOs who are working on these issues? It's because NGOs, especially local NGOs, are the sector that are best suited actually to respond to those local level risk factors and improve the quality of life and mitigate those risk factors against vulnerable populations. They're much more well suited to do that sort of work than international actors can on their own, or without NGOs, local actors as partners. So that's a very roundabout way of saying that now more than ever, funding NGOs by donor countries funding NGOs working at the local level is essential in responding to risks for mass atrocity.
Thank you, Kerry. And of course, you touch on the point that we're having this conversation from the UK perspective at a very, very critical time. Of course, yesterday, the announcement of this very regrettable merger. Wei, what's your view? How would you, as somebody who has actually founded an NGO, is kind of working on the ground with people, what would be the argument that you would put forward as to the importance of local level NGOs at this time?
Yeah, I second Kerry. Actually, yes, the local actors are the one who understand the complex contextual background. And they understand the behavior of the perpetrators. They understand the patterns and the system itself. They understand the psyche of the society. And that's why their work has been always effective, because, because of this inequality within the funding, donor, funding and resources between the big NGOs and small local NGOs. The local NGOs work might not be as big or a scale as the NGOs. However, what I'm saying is that they are the one who knows the context better and understand the situation better and know how to respond to the situations, and they have been doing the most effective work with their limited resources. And I think, therefore, if these if they are able to equip with adequate resources and funding, and they can do better job. And in my experience, we actually don't have like any funding from under this R2P line of work. We can get like funding if we talk about peace building. Sometimes sometimes even human rights protections is not popular in donor mainstreaming. So I think nowadays globally we're dealing with many issues, right? Including one of the big issue is the refugee crisis. Their approaching is from the impact, in my point of view. They're not actually, they haven't actually responded from the first place. They didn't take preventive measures, and then at the end we have these crises, and we are receiving, millions of refugees around the world, and then they are trying to, the donors and the states are trying to act from the symptom, not from the actual disease. So I think the way the world and the donors has been responding has to be shifted. It has to be more preventive measures, preventive progress, and then it has to be more locally focused. And the local NGOs and local actor has to be engaged more effectively, and the affected community have to get involved throughout the processes. And talking about COVID-19, some of the countries are not giving adequate information to its people, and the refugees are, for example, in Bangladesh, refugees are not receiving information from outside because of the internet ban, internet shutdown, and in some situations, for example, in Myanmar or even in Bangladesh, due to the country's lack of infrastructures and capacity, they're not receiving adequate protections. And eventually, if it can become a crisis. I think, it's not just it's not just about immediate human rights violations. It can be also about health. It can be also about pandemic, and everything has to be able to, to be able to make it a case and really take preventive measures from the first place. And I'm really concerned about the COVID response in some of these neighboring countries and in Myanmar itself. And on the other hand, as I said, they are preoccupied with their, COVID-19 response, whether they may be adequate or inadequate, exclusionary or inclusion to the specific groups. They are not actually, paying or responding to the actual human rights violations in the ground as well. I think these are some of the concerns generally in the ground, and people are saying that we're not just only be dying from the COVID-19, but also from hunger and from the violence attack by the armed forces and security forces, and all of this has to be taken very seriously.
Thank you. And now turning to Karen and kind of moving to the diametrically opposite kind of perspective from the kind of the top-down UN view. From how is the work from your office be impacted by this retreat into from multilateralism and the likely restriction of resources directed to on-the-ground NGOs?
Well, I think, both Kerry and Weiwei's interventions have been very valuable, and I think they apply to some extent to the UN as well. I mean, the UN itself is currently, suffering from a lack of funding in many ways. So I think it's NGOs, I think are affected much more, but even the UN as a multilateral organization, as we know, has come under severe threat. And I just wanted to pick up on two things which they said as well, and that's this. Well, actually, you started off, Thomas, by saying that, of course, in this current situation, governments are concerned about their economies. Many are going through, well, probably all in the world are going through some kind of economic crisis. And so they are going to be looking very closely at where they spend their money. And, I think that, unfortunately, this is how, governments think. And it's really about, well, what is cost effective? And I think this argument has been made, so many times and so convincingly that prevention is, more cost effective than response. Yeah. And we know this, we've seen fantastic academic studies who've actually crunched the numbers and who've shown, going in and paying for example, very expensive and long-term peacekeeping operations in a lot of countries, what the cost of that is, and then trying to figure out, well, if we look at similar situations where there was earlier action, how much money, is eventually saved. And of course, if you think of all the related, effects, if you think of things like, refugees, etc. So again, thinking from the position of states that often think in a very kind of self-interested way. My position is that, cost shouldn't matter. We should be concerned about saving lives and, preventing people from becoming victims of atrocities. But we know that that's not always, a convincing argument. So I think the costing argument, is one that perhaps we also need to produce more research on as academics to really say there's no argument that, if you want to be spending less money, this is really what you need to be doing. And maybe just one other thing that Kerry mentioned about prevention, that sometimes there's a misunderstanding also about what prevention entails. So I think there again, there's lots of work that needs to be done. We talk about prevention in a kind of very broad sense, and that makes it, I think, difficult to, again, quantify, to say, well, yeah, how do we know when we're really, preventing something or not? And I think Kerry's point that one can actually measure specific things. So if you look at things like structural prevention, right, we know what those factors are that build strong, resilient societies. And we know what the specific indicators are that have a very direct link with the, an increased risk for atrocities. Things like discrimination against women, increased violence against women. So when we see societies and states investing in, basically, addressing these issues, addressing violence against women, making sure that there's, more gender equality, we know that there are positive benefits to that. And maybe just the last thing I want to say is, particularly if we look at local NGOs, going back to this cost-effective argument, which I hate making, but I know this, this helps for states who are having to give the money. Particularly these local NGOs, these grassroots NGOs are perhaps, the most cost-effective. There are so many wonderful examples that I've come across of, women's organizations, small organizations on the ground, youth organizations with very, very little money are doing tremendous work, that states would never be able to do, because as Weiwei says, they just don't have that, they just don't have the local networks. They don't have the same understanding of what is necessary in particular local situations. So yeah, I think this is, and this is why my office also works very closely with these types of grassroots NGOs, because we know that's where effective prevention happens.
Thank you. And staying with this theme and touching also on something that Kerry mentioned in his opening remarks, we are seeing the retreat of many state actors away from multilateral commitments, and the things that they used to do are often now being done by NGOs, as you point out, by NGOs on the ground. I suppose the question is, how far can NGOs go to fulfilling the vacuum left behind by states when they do retreat from a commitment to build strong, tolerant and resilient societies? So, of course, nobody doubts the willingness, but how far can they practically fulfill this role? I don't know, Kerry, perhaps you want to, as this was inspired by your point, if you'd like to.
Well, I think, despite the fact that I'm saying that what we're seeing right now is this retreat of states from engaging with the responsibility to protect both domestically and internationally, I'm not one of those, academics who believes the state is the root of all evil. I think the state is ultimately, we need the state as a partner in order to realize prevention. And therefore, this goes back to the point that NGOs are the ones to step up in the face of this retreating of the state, and that's an undue burden for NGOs to hold, a necessary burden, because we as a global community need someone to be stepping up, and we can all be a part of that effort, of course, and we're seeing that through global activist movements around the world. But ultimately, what we need is the states to become partners in these prevention efforts. That doesn't mean, of course, that states step up, take over this responsibility, and civil society and NGOs disappear, right? They step back. A real functioning democracies work because partly of that contentious relationship between the state and civil society. And hopefully what's created is this moment where there's a collaboration where both are learning from each other in a sort of dialectic mode, but that the civil society is always there to push the state a bit further, because we can always do better. We can't demand of NGOs to do everything that states do. We can't expect of them to do everything that states are supposed to be doing. But especially in this moment, more and more, I'm relying and I'm trusting NGOs a lot more than I am state actors, as I wait for states to resume accepting that responsibility that they've reiterated many times in the past, but now seem to be forgetting it's only rhetoric and not action.
Thank you. And I'm very cognizant of the time and that we have a lot more to get through. So I hope the Weiwei and Karen will forgive me if I don't turn to you onto that one. And I'd like to bring a question now from Jennifer George of Peterhouse College at the University of Cambridge. How can NGOs balance accountability to beneficiaries and accountability to donors if the needs of beneficiaries are not necessarily the same as the requirements of donors? Karen, did you want to take this one first? It's not an easy one.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I should be the one that's responding to this, given that I don't represent an NGO or a donor. So I think that puts me in a difficult position in terms of answering it. I think I mean, you know, this is just kind of an offhand kind of response. I'm thinking in terms of writing, you know, funding proposals as an academic. And I think there are ways and means of making things meet that wouldn't necessarily, you know, be seen as compatible. So that would be my one very kind of practical answer. But I think it's also about playing, you know, kind of playing that mediatory role where you actually are able to show, and I think this is important for NGOs perhaps as well, to really be able to show to donors, and you know, donors have a particular, they work in, you know, in terms of programs and structures and funding models. And I think it's really important for donors, for NGOs who need this kind of funding to really try to get into the heads of donors and understand what it is they are looking for, and to try to somehow frame their demands in a way that also makes sense to the donors. And I think sometimes it's just a bit of, you know, it's a translation game. It's really about saying, well, in the end, perhaps our interests are very similar. You know, the detail might look different, but ultimately what we're trying to achieve really is very similar. But, you know, that's just my very uninformed opinion about that. So I'll leave it to the experts to answer.
And Weiwei, I'd be very, very curious to hear your views on this, and if this is a kind of a strategy that you have adopted by the NGOs, and how that feels having to do that, particularly in the midst of kind of ongoing crimes against humanity, from the NGO perspective.
Yeah, I mean, we're very small, you know, I have a very small team and we're very small. We perform with a very small budget. So, you know, I'm not in that position to, you know, to give a comprehensive answer to it. But based on my experience, you know, it's, you know, as Karen said, it's kind of, it's difficult actually. It's a skill, unnecessary skill that you, the burden and skill that NGO need to carry, NGO leaders need to carry, because you know, the donors and the states, you know, has their own agenda sometime or interests, and they try to give money based on that, you know, without necessarily understanding or responding to the situations in particular conditions or in the ground. So that was one part of the problem. And therefore, you know, it's become very difficult, the NGOs role become very difficult to adjust the need and the accountability to the beneficiaries and then to the donor. And it's not easy job. And in one, I mean, let me give you just one example. Like when 1 million refugees Rohingya become refugees in Bangladesh, most of the states, you know, like pouring money under the framework of PVE, preventing violence extremism. And you project the whole community as the potential terrorists. And the approach itself is wrong. And the feeling that of the community by seeing this approach has been very painful. They have to respond something that is not necessarily or relevant to this particular conditions. And the actors who implement this agenda or this, you know, programs somehow has to adapt themselves to this framework. And some of the youth organizations from Bangladesh, you know, the Bangladeshi Youth and Educational Organization, they need to frame the work rather than youth empowerment or, you know, vocational trainings. They need to frame this work under the PVE, preventing violence extremism. If the delivery and the implementation is not, you know, happen with happen properly or with due processes, with the sensitive, with the considerations of the sensitivity around it, and it can go wrong. And that's where, you know, you are not accountable to the donors as well as not the beneficiary as well. And it's a waste of money, effort, and, you know, energy.
Thank you. And Kerry, did you want to very quickly add anything to this one?
Just super quickly, I'll say this is one of this balancing act is one that's of essential concern for any NGO worker. Sometimes it feels like you're spending as much time reporting and crafting reports of what you're doing as actually implementing programming and helping people. But in an ideal world, this, I think, and when it works well, what it requires is sensitivity, as Weiwei said, on the side of the NGO, sensitivity to the fact that the donors are responding to a constituency, and therefore they need to, they probably have really good intentions at heart, but they also have certain things that, milestones they just have to meet, benchmarks they have to meet, and we have to help them do that. But also in an ideal situation, there's also flexibility on the part of the donor and a willingness for the donor to think a little bit outside of the box and to think creatively about how those benchmarks can be adapted to also respond to the needs on the ground and the way that an NGO functions.
I think one quick response. I think the most important thing here is that in responding to these serious issues is that listening to the people and listening to the community itself seriously, not just having assessment ticking the box, but seriously talking to these relevant actors in the community, among the community, finding their needs and responding in an appropriate approach, not necessarily coming from your own interests and the agenda, and that might not be necessarily solving the situations in the ground. Listening is the most important thing, I guess. Consultation and listening through all actors, not just donors. I think all actors in this field has to be consulting and listening to the affected communities, and then things can be much easier and effective.
Many thanks for that. And I was going to really try and sneakily slip in one more question in the limited time we have, but I think that's a really good statement to close on. So I'll say it's now time to bring a close to this video panel on the role of NGOs and the responsibility to protect, from the Centre for Geopolitics at the University of Cambridge. I would like to thank all of our audience for your many delving and thought-provoking questions, and apologise that we could only get to a fraction of them. And I thank again our panellists, Karen Smith, Kerry Wigan and Weiwei Nu. Please to check back shortly on the Centre's website at www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk. That's www.cfg.polis.cam.ac.uk, where the video of this discussion will shortly be available to view. And the video of yesterday's opening discussion is already online, the opening part of this two-part discussion. And I hope that you will be able to join another of our upcoming panels. In 2 weeks' time, we're going to be joined by Dr. Simon Adams, who's the director of the Global Centre Responsibility to Protect, and as well as other panelists to discuss the consequences of the Rwandan genocide for mass atrocity prevention today. And then 2 weeks after that, we're going to be joined by Kerry Wigan's colleague at Binghamton University Institute for Genocide and Mass Atrocity Prevention to look at Indigenous peoples and the responsibility to protect. And so I very much hope that you can join us then. And I'd say again, thank you very much to our panelists and thank you to our audience, and we'll see you soon.